Hi kids, I'm going to read you a fun story today about Curious George and the apple harvest. It was harvest time and Mr. Renkins needed help picking his apples. George and his friends, the man with the yellow hat, were happy to lend a hand. Or foot. Mr. Renkins explained that they needed to collect every apple. I'm going to join the missus round back, he said. Once you fill that cart, you can unload it into the washing trough. Mr. Renkins took his cart full of apples to the barn and dumped them into the water. It must be their bath time, George thought. George climbed up the branches, collected the shiny red apples in his friend's hat, and put them into the cart. What fun! High up in the tree, he saw a Jumpy Squirrel picking apples too. George decided to help. He took Jumpy's apple and tossed it into the cart with the rest of Mr. Renkins' apples. But Jumpy wanted that apple for himself. He leaped in to take it back, and George tried to stop him. Easy now, George. That lever releases all of the apples, said his friend. George looked at the lever. He thought it was an excellent way to get Jumpy out of the cart. No, George, no! George pulled the lever and Jumpy tumbled out along with all of the apples. That's okay, said his friend with a sigh. We can gather them up again. But Jumpy had found his apple and he ran to hide it in the barn. George decided to follow. George looked around the inside of the barn in wonder. There were all sorts of things to climb on and swing from. It must be some kind of monkey playground. But George was not here to play. He had to get that apple from Jumpy. If only it weren't so dark in the barn. He found the light switch and flipped it on. Everything moved. It was a machine, not a playground. George wondered how it worked. He watched the buckets scoop up the apples. He decided they must carry the apples high away from the squirrels. But wait, where was Jumpy? There he was. Jumpy still had the apple he took from the cart. George chased Jumpy, grabbed the apple, and threw it into a bin high out of reach. Suddenly, the machine stopped. George found a button and pushed. The machine started again. This time, all of the parts started working, including the moving belt. But when he looked up, he saw all of the Renkinson's beautiful apples being chopped to bits. The chopped up apples dropped into a giant barrel, and a lid was lowered tightly on them. Too tightly. Liquid began to pour out of the barrel. What a mess! George had an idea. He ran up and put his mouth under the liquid. It tasted good, a lot like apples, but there was too much of it. Luckily, he saw some empty containers. George scrambled to put the containers on the moving belt fast enough to catch the liquid. Then he looked down at the end of the belt and saw the containers falling onto the floor. Uh-oh, George ran to catch them. They needed to stop the machine. Soon he had filled all of the containers, but the golden liquid continued to pour out. He looked around for another container, and he saw a big pair of rubber boots. As the last boot was filled, the liquid stopped pouring out and the machine stopped. Whew! The farmers and George's friends appeared in the doorway. Well, I'll be, Mr. Renkins exclaimed. George froze. The Renkinsons would surely be upset that he ruined all of their apples. George, Mrs. Renkins rushed up to him. You've done a fantastic job. All that cider already pressed and bottled. Thank you. This is some machine, said the man with the yellow hat. See, the apples are washed here, Mrs. Rankin explained. Then they are lifted up to the chopper because chopped apples give more juice. The juice is pressed out of the apples and then bottled. George had not ruined the apples after all. He had turned them into cider. Mr. Renkins handed an apple to George. Here, you've earned it, he said. George knew someone who wanted the apple more than he did. He'd had enough apples for one day. Now the apple trees are budding right now, and if the frost doesn't get them, after they flower, those little flowers will become apples after they're pollinated by the bees. And then they grow and they grow and they take a long time all summer, but late summer, early fall, the apples will begin to be harvested. You can go to farm markets or sometimes get fresh apples in your grocery store. Then there'll be cider and you can drink it and you can remember the story of Curious George. Have a great day.